Hi, Shweta.
This much. Hi.
Hi. Give me a minute to just check if we're live and then we'll come back.
Yeah, there's usually a lag. It says starting soon, which means it will start. It will start in a. There's usually a minute. Yeah, it started. I can see that.
Started? Okay,
Yeah.
lovely. So I'm just going to close
I'm going to mute the LinkedIn page so that, yeah, mute on
and
LinkedIn.
come back here. Okay. Lovely. Lovely to be back conversing with you and literally picking up where we left. We had a wonderful first conversation 2 weeks ago on identity, where we looked at what identity was. And we also had some wonderful engagement from our listeners or viewers, and we carried over some of those questions for today. So, shall we get to those questions first, Shweta, and then move into continuing the
Yeah, I
conversation?
think so. I think so. I think so. I think it was wonderful to get those questions and we left them unanswered. So
Okay,
I think
so
we
I'll
should start
pick
with it.
them. Okay, so I'll pick them up one by one.
You
So,
want to ask the first question? And
yeah, so one question by
I
Sandeep, and this,
remember. Yeah,
yeah, this one
go ahead.
was identity synthesis versus identity confusion. And
Got it.
how do you deal with that?
Got it. You want to go first? You want me to take a
Sure,
shot?
sure. I mean, I have been thinking about this, and so here's my take on it. And first of all, I think it's a very good question, right? So and just to bring everybody else up on speed, if somebody is watching this without watching that, so we were looking at multiple identities. We were talking about, for example, each of us having multiple identities, and these identities can be linked to our role, they can be linked to literally how we show up, they can be individual or collective identities. And according to me, identity synthesis is good to have. It's not bad to have. If you want to synthesize multiple identities in a particular situation, it can be done. I'm not against it. There are times when I do it, for example, but I also don't have a sense of overwhelming need to necessarily synthesize my separate identities. I'm happy to hold them and to step into them according to context as and when they are. Because of that, personally, I don't experience identity confusion because I'm okay to have these multiple identities and let them sort of be in the background and know that I can step in and out of them as required. Now, should a certain, let's say, a certain situation require me to synthesize two different identities, maybe my poet identity and professor identity into one, and on rare occasions, I don't always synthesize these two, but on rare occasions, sometimes I do, and then I would synthesize them and then have a combined conjuncted identity. But really not getting ever into the question of is it this or that, because they can be both and they don't have to be both together.
Got it. Um, I interpreted the question as really what is the tension between identity synthesis and identity confusion. I think honestly, I was a little stumped, so I decided to do what I do best research. And I think for our readers, it helps to first explain what identity synthesis is. Identity synthesis is feeling like a single person, right? There are different parts of your identity. You're a mother, you're a professional, you're a daughter. Feeling like all of that comes together and you feel like I know who I am. That is identity synthesis, right? What is identity confusion? Identity confusion is the opposite. It is, I don't really know who I am. When I show up at work, I don't really feel like that's that person. When I show up at home, I don't feel connected to the person that I'm showing up as. And that tends to be then identity confusion. And I think it first shows up in Erickson's model, and it's the central tenet of. I'm guessing the person who asked the question came from it from that perspective. It's the central tenet of how Erickson describes adolescence and being able to integrate. I mean, a successful adolescence is one where you're able to explore all these various identities and have a very clear sense of who you are, right? But having said that, I think identity synthesis or confusion is something we face with our whole lives, right? I, for instance, and the example I wanted to give was my career exploration that resulted in me becoming a coach and a business storyteller, right? From the day I started working in a corporate, I felt like this wasn't me. It wasn't me. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know the right answer, but I had a disconnect. That was my identity confusion. I continued with that confusion for many years. And then I tried on a bunch of different identities over time. I tried becoming an entrepreneur, but was I a real entrepreneur if I did not enjoy the risk? I started a small business. Again, was I a real, but it was a really small scale business. It did not fulfill the part of me that wanted to feel like a professional. It felt too small. And so through that process of trying different things, I eventually learned to become an independent consultant, a storyteller, and a coach. And finally, at age whatever, 45 or 50, all these various things that I do now feels like the real me. So I have finally synthesized these various elements of my identity where I had confusion. Right. So that's my explanation. I think Ramya does a beautiful job of not needing to synthesize it. I have struggled with confusion and I have felt a need to synthesize it. And I have through a lot of trial and error. Right.
Wonderful. And I'm so glad that our listeners are getting to hear both these perspectives, right? And yeah, different ways of dealing with the multiple identities, which we will have, right? And the same thing as
Yeah.
the mother. And beautiful. Thanks for sharing, Shraddha. And you mentioned
Yeah.
Erickson's model. Shall we talk a little more about that? What fascinates you about that?
Or should we answer the other question first? Or we'll
Oh
come back to
yes.
the other question. Since this is a
Okay,
direct segue into the
Erickson.
Ericsson model, let's talk about that. Um,
Also,
so
just
when I was researching the Ericsson model,
Mhm.
I think what I was fascinated by was, of course, for those that don't know, Erickson is the first psychologist who actually introduces the vocabulary of identity. Till then, we've discussed personality, we've discussed various other things. He's the first real big guy who talks about identity and talks about building blocks being formed from childhood. There are 8 stages. I will not go into all 8 stages. You can Google that. And at each stage, you acquire first, you learn trust, then you learn the next is a little bit of independence, so an industry, and through your interaction with one is yourself and the world, you develop through your lifespan an evolving identity. I think Ramya's dropped off. Yeah,
Yeah.
some problem there. Hey, you're back. Ramya? I'm just going to give it a minute so she joins back. She's frozen. Hey, Ramya.
Hello, Shweta?
Yeah, yeah, I think you dropped off.
Okay,
Right?
fine. Go on.
Yeah, so I think coming back to Erickson's model, I think to me it's fascinating What I like about the model is what we take for granted today, a sense of identity. Till the 1950s or 60s, nobody was even talking about it. So I think it's fascinating that he came up with this idea of identity, right? It is a very Western centric model. It is very, very much, uh, very, very much a Western idea of how he develops the model and what skills get developed or what parts of your identity get developed is a very individualistic Western centric model. But having said that, it lays the template for everything that follows, right? So I think in that sense, it's quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
What
I
about
tell
you,
you,
Ramya?
I tell you what I don't like about the Ericsson model. Again, I mean, I'm not taking away from the mammoth
Yeah.
contribution, foundational contribution that it has been, but it's actually linked to the 8 stages. I like his model, but I just personally, my own development of identity did not follow those 8 stages, right? It didn't fall into those age brackets. So, quite as a researcher, I know that, if it's sort of true for majority of people, we're like, okay, this works. But personally, it wasn't true for me. So so he talks about identity conflicts and, what you grapple with at different stages, right? 0 to 3 years, and 3 to 5, and 5 to 12, and then adolescence, and then 20s, and then I think there's a 30 to around
Yeah.
60 is another age,
40
and
to
then
60 and then 60 plus.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the questions that I've grappled with and the kind of conflicts, they've never matched those buckets. So maybe because it didn't fit for me, I just I like the questions that he raises. But for example, the role versus identity that he talks about is something that happens at adolescence. I think that happens all the time. It can happen later also, right? And the
Correct.
kind of
Correct.
conflicts that he talks about that are supposed to come after 60, that was happening for me in my 20s. Right, and so that chronology mapping is something that doesn't work for me. But I think most of or the rebellion that he says, so happens at age 0 to 3, that happens even now for me. So I would like to see each of those conflicts as questions that we grapple with simultaneously our entire life. I With that, I'm actually good to go. I think he raises very, very interesting points, but I would like to reject that age wise bracketing of it.
Which is fair, right? Because I mean, if you look at our other author for today that we were talking about, Herminia Ibarra, essentially what he speaks about as an adolescent conflict, and what our one of the readers spoke about is synthesis and confusion, is actually what leads us to do. It is what we call midlife crisis as well, right? When it comes to our careers, it is
Yeah.
exactly that, because we are no longer happy with what we do, and we are trying on these various other professional identities before we settle on something that we really like. So I agree with you that obviously it is something. But here's a very interesting anecdote, right?
And if I can
I
add,
was
even what he talks about as post 60,
Go ahead.
that also happens in midlife, which is question of, is life meaningful or meaningless, and the wisdom versus the disillusionment. And all of those questions are also happening in midlife now. But go on. Yeah.
Correct. So I was really curious about two things. When I was reading about the model, I said, why did this man get interested in identity? Right? What about him? Because context is everything. And two, why did this theory become so prevalent so quickly? Right? Why did it become the overarching theory on identity? So, so interesting anecdote about Erickson is that he's actually just done a diploma from Freud's school, Vienna Psycho something institute. He did not do a PhD. He's not a trained psychologist. He was a practicing one. So a lot of his theory of identity is actually his own. He struggled with multiple identity questions his own life, right? Uh, he was born. Uh, I think he was born with a certain last name. his mom, but I think Salomonsen was his first last name. Then, but that first last name did not belong to his biological father. Then his mom married another man, another gentleman, Homburger, and he was given to believe that Homburger was his biological father, but he discovered later that he wasn't, and that was created a lot of confusion in him about who he himself was. And eventually, if you see his name now, it's Eric Erickson. It was through grappling with his own sense of identity that he eventually discarded all these other names and created this made up last name for himself. So he's someone who struggled with identity questions, not just in terms of parenting and various life stages. He was also someone who was a Jew who later converted to Christianity. He was a Scandinavian boy who grew up in Germany. So he grappled with these questions of identity through a bulk of his life, right? So that's so his theory came from his personal experience. And the other thing was, why did identity become so prevalent? Because the time at which he came up with this theory in the 1950s and 60s, the world is in flux. The world has just emerged from World War II. New countries are being born around you. There's a civil war. Race is suddenly being questioned. Gender, the women's rights movements. So people, and for the first time ever, teenager is a life phase that people recognize. Right? Adolescence is a life phase that people recognize in the post-World War. Till the pre-World War era, it's children growing into adulthood. Teenage as a phase, as a period of life, is not really recognized. It is in this world order where everybody is working towards discovering. Countries are trying to find their identity. Women are trying to find their identity. Everybody is struggling with identity. That he comes up with this brand new theory, and it sticks because it suddenly gives people language for what they're trying to go through. And that's the context in which this whole theory is born. Of course, with time and relevance, we might now, it's 70, 80 years. I'm sure people have questioned it. People have seen how, whether it still works, whether it applies in different contexts. If you see India, for instance, those 8 stages may not apply. We are a collectivist society. Some of that might change. But nonetheless, I still feel it's such a powerful, the birth of the idea of identity happened in such an interesting time.
I really liked what you said, Shweta, about why that time was ripe for constructing even a construct or a frame, which is what identity really is. It's a frame, right? And
Yeah.
the you see something like, countries, people, they were all searching for, like, who am I, what am I, where do I operate
Yeah.
from, which brings us to really the utility of what is the utility of identity. Why do we need an identity, right? So we talked about what it was, but why do we need it, and do we need it? Why do we need it? How does it help us? How does it affect us? And I
Yeah, and
think
how did people manage for millennia without ever needing it, right? If the idea came up
exactly,
in the 1950s and 60s, you know.
so I love that,
Yeah, I
right?
don't
So
know. What do you think?
yeah. So
Yeah.
what I think is that it's a very, like you said, it was created to serve a purpose, so it's a functional need. And of course, because it's created to serve a purpose, it has its pros, it has its utility, and it has its limitations, drawbacks, and downsides. And speaking of utility, I think for work, it has a very great and solid utility. And that's actually that we can go and start looking at our working identities, made very popular by Herminia Ibarra, and how, when we transition also from one role to another, or one kind of work to another, what she talks about is the construction and experimentation with these provisional selves or possible future selves and possible identities, even before we've stepped on it. It's like when you go and buy clothes, you go to the changing room and you try it on. Literally, that's the idea of these possible selves and possible identities. and easing into it, getting familiar, and then operating from that. Because the utility finally comes when we embody a certain identity, and the utility actually comes from our mental models. Quickly link back to what we looked at last episode on the Asian women experiment, right? So there we saw how
Yeah.
identities are directly related to our performance, how we behave, how we perform, how we think, even in a math exam. So that's the utility of an identity. So when I'm holding an identity that I am a professor and I walk into a classroom, I walk a certain way, I talk a certain way, my brain will access certain kinds of information, it will speak in a certain way. And all of those attributes are coming from that foundation inside my brain that I am a professor. At another time, when I'm walking into a place saying I am a mother, literally, certain hormones are going to be released. Oxytocin will start taking a big seat in my whole biology, in my neurobiology, chemical, chemistry, all of that. I'll speak in a certain way. I'll feel a certain way. I'll become sensitive to certain things. I'll have certain bhava, certain expressions, certain amount of kindness. So different aspects of my thinking, emotion, biology, all of that will surface. If I have an identity of I am a sportsman, and I'm, and I get that into the forefront, you actually see even our physiology changes, because our biology is, everything's governed by the brain. So that's the functional utility of identity, that it leads into behavior, strengths, attributes. It will also activate certain memories, yeah, memory centers. So that kind of knowledge will come to the forefront of our thinking, become accessible. So that's the utility part of it. Of course, the limitation part of it is in doing that. It is making a specific parts of us come out to function with the world. So you can think of it as a limitation, or you can think of it as a
What about
advantage.
what about using identity as a way to form in groups and out groups, right? Belonging. We
Hmm.
form groups of people around identities as well, right?
Very, yeah, very powerful. So we have personal identity, we have group identity, we have, and those groups can be large groups. We also have relational identity, like mother, wife, and all are relational identities in relation to another person. And all of these, they're all very powerful, and they all have these functions. And as you said, the group identity is very powerful, right? To feel that sense of belonging, operate as a team, operate as a group. It can be very, very, very powerful. It can also have its very dark sides, which we are seeing
Downsides
in
as
the
well, right? Because then you create little cults also come from that kind of.
a lot of
Um,
conflict, any kind of conflict, every kind of us versus them. I uh, i mean i think i think group identities can have very polarized dark sides, but hey,
yeah.
everything comes at the plus side is things
And
like
how about
patriotism.
using identity as a tool for growth? Like, how does it help us grow?
Hmm, good question. I think growth is a place where identity has as much of downsides as positives, which means I think so an identity, again, if I have an identity like I'm a speaker,
Hmm.
the way it'll help me grow is now my brain is going to be on the lookout for resources on how to become a better speaker, who are the speakers, what should speakers do, right? So it's filtering out and getting me all the relevant resources to grow. So in that way, identity can help me choose my curriculum, like just the natural curriculum, life's curriculum, not literally opening a book, but allowing life to bring in all those things into my experience and learning. So it helps in focusing my growth. But I also think identity restricts us from growth. Can I share an example here?
Yeah.
Which is, and I learned this through parenting, really, right? Where when my son was growing up, when children grow up, their identity changes very rapidly. Chuck, chuck, chuck. And I was having a tough time keeping up with that. But I also realized I was so compassionate about him shifting and growing his identity at a natural pace, right? So, like at one time, he was all into Lego, and we got all the Legos, and he was really into it. And then the Legos was put away. He was all into football and this, and then into coding, and then frisbee. And a part of me was like, hey, but you love Lego. Look at all the Lego is just sitting. Hey, you love football. No, but mama, but now I like this. But remember, you loved coding. You were so good. What happened to coding? But mama, now I like ultimate frisbee, right? And I was like, wow. And I was letting him grow and just shed each previous identity. Like, yeah, that was me. That was me last year, mama. That was last month, mama. That was last. Now I'm this. And I was like, okay, now you're this. Let's
So
go
it's
with
like,
it. Yeah. And it was so organic and beautiful. And I realized I don't give myself that permission. Like, I I too should be allowed to grow like that. That yes, that was last year I was interested in careers. I was teaching emotion. Now I'm interested in this. Now I want to grow into this. Now I want to grow. But and I was like, wow. So I started taking leaves and started being kinder. Actually, this answers on one the other question we had last time about the past identities. And my short answer to that really is to be kind to ourselves, like we are to our children. That okay, that was my identity in the past. I operated from then. It was true then. If it's not working for now, that's okay. That can stay with my past self. And now I'm choosing a new identity, and that's totally fine. So, what do you think,
it's
Shar?
a little bit schizophrenic to completely give that up, no? I
What
think,
is
I think,
schizophrenia? I mean, I'm not going to get into judgment
I
about
mean,
that.
I
Why?
shouldn't be using that
Yeah,
word lightly.
yeah, but sorry.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I can imagine that it's a little. I personally see identity as something that is continuous, right? And I agree that I think when it is continuous, there is limitation of growth, right? Like I see myself as someone who is not an adventure lover, which means I'm never going to try anything adventurous, right? I see myself as so there are memories, there are beliefs, there are values that have accumulated over time that allow me to grow in a particular direction, but they also hamper me from growing in another direction, right? So there is basically like the branches, a certain type of flower and a certain type of fruit is going to thrive in this identity tree. Other types of fruits and flowers and birds are not going to be welcome. So I think it does create a little bit of a polarizing effect, right? And
Yeah.
and yeah, and is there anything else? I think we're coming up on the end of time. We can speak a couple of minutes about this idea of evolving identities and Herminia Ibarra and how to discover your working identity.
So, what Ibarra talks about is really experimentation. And while the purpose is to discover, she approaches it more like prototyping, right? So it's not something cast in stone. It's not there. It's not like a treasure hunt that it's already there and you go searching for it. Or so she's really like talking about you experiment, you try out something, wear that identity, sort of believe that this is who I am, this is what I do, see how it works with you, get the feedback, and then you ease yourself into it. And what I really like Herminia Ibarra's approach, because she hasn't theorized in uh, like in abstraction. Her theory has actually come from the lived experience of researching the journeys of people who've made career transitions. And what she really talks about in her books and works and research and all is that people themselves forget the messy prototyping, experimenting, trying on times. Because once they've transitioned, they actually our mind forgets all of that. And she uses a childbirth analogy in one of the places where we forget all that pain and labor and all that middle messiness, and we just say, oh, now I'm here because the new identity is completely claimed and owned, and they're like firing on all cylinders and working. But when you actually take them back memory lane, or you explore it through diary studies and longer longitudinal ways, you see that it has been that messy journey of okay, this was the past, leaving it behind, trying something, holding both together, then leaving that, trying this more, trying, playing with it, prototyping, seeing, and then sort of easing into it. So what I like about it is the looseness, like separating the self from the identities, really not making the identity really a direct answer to who am I, but who can I be, who I was, what can I be, and playing around with those possibilities. I like that
So,
looseness.
so it's interesting that my life is actually played out like that. I hadn't read Herminia Ibarra at that point in time. I think Ramya's fallen off.
Am I back?
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that it's interesting that she says that I'm a classic living prototype, given the number of career shifts I've had to coming to my current identity. I think my only sort of problem with her thing is the timeline. I think somewhere she says it takes between 3 and 7 years. Mine took, I don't know, 15. So am I a failure? So I think it's just different for different people, right? I think just accepting that careers are complex, they're tricky, and that you do need to try it and live it. And that process in between of where you don't really have a proper identity is very difficult. It's incredibly the reason why so many people struggle to make that jump is because the messy middle is truly a messy middle. It is like you are adrift. You don't know when you're at a party, when you're meeting people, who do you say you are? It is real. The conflict of not knowing who you are is real. And it takes a while to find that anchor. It really does.
I
But it's
think,
a
sorry,
go
no, no,
ahead.
finish what no, no, finish what you were saying, and then I'll add.
No, so I'm saying I'm a living sort of example of working identity, and I've seen its pros and its cons, and but it's a fabulous idea. I mean, there is no other way to do it. There is no other way. There was no other way for me to arrive at becoming a coach and a storyteller, except through all those various experimentations. I had to become an entrepreneur and discover that I did not like the long hours. I did not like the fundraising. I did not like the risk, the financial risk that came with it. There was no other way to do it but having done it for those many years. So there is no shortcut to it, but it's a very painful way to get there.
Yeah. So I'm going to. So for me, I would agree with some of it, not all of it. So I totally agree with that. There is pain, and there's no shortcut. I agree with those, but I also think it can be. There can be pain, but not confusion. Let me explain. And for example, and I think this is where the idea of multi potentialites and portfolio careers can really help. And while Ibarra has really studied mostly, at least in her, the original work, one to another, right? One
Correct.
identity A to identity B. But enter portfolio careers, and I have a portfolio career now, and I also, have worked with others who are transition. So portfolio career is where you do multiple things at the same time. So my transition has been portfolio. So you don't let go. So I didn't let go of the professor identity. I didn't let go of my mom identity. I didn't let go of those, but I just added a new one. I'm holding the multiple, added coach. I added influencer, right? So I added the new ones,
So then,
and
yeah. So
sometimes
you don't go through that period of confusion because you're just adding and you're not.
you're just adding, and you're like, I'm this also. And so this classic thing about portfolio careers is sometimes called the and. I am this. I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm not, but some people,
And
right? And this, and giving ourselves permission to be that. And while it doesn't what it allows you to do is that whole experimentation that Ibarra talks about. It allows you to experiment. So you can slowly do less and less and less of one, but do more of that. Or this doesn't work, do less of this, but do more of that. So the riskiness is gone, and you're never in that, oh my God, who am I? Right? So which is why it is not all smooth. There is a messiness, but there's that heart-wrenching gut confusion that's never there. So it's a little easier. Is a little easier to do it that way.
that's interesting. And I
Not the
like the
same.
word and. I like the word and there.
Yeah.
The and for the multi-potentialite for the portfolio career, but also for our multiple identities, which we will talk more about next time, right? So I
Yes.
think we should wind down on
Yes.
that happy note that identity is really a collection of ands in our lives rather than ors. And that is really where we want to go next time as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds good. See you next week,
Wonderful. Shall
Shraddha.
we wind down? That
Yes,
was a
let's do that.
fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Yep. We should leave.
I'm just closing it once.
Yeah.